All right, the coaches poll was released today, and I sort of agreed with it. I mean, these coaches had their opinions, obviously. So, I'm gonna put my opinion out there. I know no one asked for it, but this is probably what I'm gonna do. And this is my preseason poll. Obviously, preseason polls really don't matter. They're just polls to say what people think and how the season should start, and then you watch the season, and that's really how it goes. So, here's the um Here's the coaches poll that was released. Alabama at 1, the defending national champions, has 63 votes for number 1 spot. Oklahoma's the only one that had other receiving votes for number 1 with 2. Clemson's at 2. Oklahoma's at 3. Ohio State's at 4. Georgia is at 5. Texas A&M is at 6. Notre Dame is at 7. Iowa State is at 8, North Carolina at 9, and Cincinnati at 10. Your bottom 5 are Ole Miss at 25, Coastal Carolina at 24, Louisiana at 23, Oklahoma State at 22, Washington at 21. I sort of agree with how this poll is. There's a few teams that I would switch around, and just because I have high expectations for, those expectations might be crushed by the end of the season, depending on how well they perform. But we're going to go through how I think the schedule is going to go, and then we're going to look back and discuss teams that I didn't talk about. All right, at my number 1 team, I have Alabama. I can't choose Alabama to go. If you want to put Clemson at 1, that's fine. If you want to put Oklahoma at 1, that's fine. The top 3 for me are either going to be Oklahoma, Clemson, and Alabama. Alabama's at 1 because they're the national champions, well, the defending national champions. And I just cannot put Alabama any lower because of the way Alabama has performed in the past. Nick Saban, it doesn't matter. You can sleep through the entire season and you can know Alabama's probably going to be in the playoffs. Alabama's probably going to be in the top 3. Alabama's probably going to be in the top 4. They are getting into the playoffs some way. That rarely never happens. 2019 was an anomaly. But Alabama's my number 1 team. They might win another national championship this year. They might go consecutive years and back to back, or they just might fall off the map. Who knows? But Alabama is just too good. Nick Saban is too good just for me to put anywhere below 1. Okay, number 2, I have Oklahoma. I'm very high on Oklahoma. Obviously, they have Spencer Rattler, which is the Heisman favorite. So, I mean, Oklahoma's offense is elite. The only thing that's kept them from winning a national championship is their defense. Um, I want to talk about Oklahoma just a little bit more than any other team on here because I have very high hopes for Oklahoma, and they're probably one of my favorites to win the championship this year. Oklahoma's problems in the few years they've been in the playoffs is their defense. They've given up way too many points. I think they gave up 63 points to LSU in 2019 when they got there. Their defense went into overtime with Georgia in 2018 and they lost again in 20 when they played Alabama. They had a lead at halftime, then their defense gave up so many points that Alabama came back and beat them. Oklahoma's defense is a lot better this year. So I have high hopes on them that their defense is going to keep them in games and going to win them games. I did my predictions for their season before, and I think they're going to go undefeated, depending on if they can beat teams like Kansas State and Texas. They tend to lose that one stupid game every single season, like they lost to Kansas State last year, which was an embarrassment. They just fell off the map once they lost to Iowa State and Kansas State. And if they want to get into the championship this year, they cannot lose that game. Iowa State would be an acceptable loss, but they're not going to get into the playoffs if they lose to Iowa State. It's an acceptable loss because Iowa State is a really good team. I have high hopes on them as well. But Oklahoma's going to have to. Their defense is just going to be good this year. It's going to be a lot better than you've seen under Lincoln Riley. Their offense is always elite. You can pencil them in for about 40 points a game, 35, 40 points a game. They're going to score a lot. So Oklahoma's my number 2 team. At number 3, I have the Clemson Tigers. Clemson is building a dynasty at this point. They have won, I think, 2 national championships since the playoff era, and they beat Alabama twice. Right, yeah, they beat Alabama twice. That's the only championships they've gotten. Um, their defense is going to be great this year. They're going to be an elite defense. They can just sleepwalk through the ACC, meaning they're just going to go get into playoffs no matter what. Because what competition do you have in the ACC other than occasionally North Carolina and Miami? And Clemson doesn't have to play any of those teams. They don't have to play Miami or North Carolina. They don't draw them out of the out of the other division. So Clemson's my top three because they're probably going to get in the playoffs this year, unless they screw up somehow during the season by losing to Boston College or Florida State. Unless they screw up by losing to those teams, then I don't see Clemson staying out of the playoffs, and I don't see them staying out of the top five or top three. But the only way I could see them messing up is in the ACC championship game against probably Miami or North Carolina. My favorite is Miami. I mean, North Carolina to play in the ACC championship game. That's the only loss I think Clemson could have this season. So Clemson's my number three team. For number four, I have the Georgia Bulldogs. I'm extremely high on Georgia this year, but I am very cautious with my optimism when it comes to Georgia. Georgia Georgia has the Atlanta curse. It started all the way back in 2018 with the Atlanta Falcons playing the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl. Well, sorry, Falcons fans. I'm a Falcons fan, and it pains me to explain this, but Atlanta had a 28-3 lead against New England, and they came back and they lost the Super Bowl, and Tom Brady won another one. Georgia ever since and Atlanta ever since has struggled to hell and back with this kind of game. Um, Georgia versus Alabama in the 2018 playoff. They had I believe, a 13-0 lead. Going into halftime, and Alabama ended up beating Georgia in overtime in the most remarkable wins in college football. The it was just Georgia needs to be able to consistently be good. They have a good quarterback in JT Daniels, and their defense is going to be great. You can always know that Georgia's defense is going to be amazing under Kirby Smart because he's a defensive genius. So Georgia is going to be good this year. Georgia can challenge Alabama for the SEC championship. Let's see if Kirby Smart can beat Alabama. That depends on how well they play and depends on if they choke a lead again. But Georgia's also one of my favorites for the championship game. If I had to choose between any of these teams, I would probably say Georgia is going to be in the playoff. I mean, we've seen Alabama and Georgia be in the playoff. We've seen that happen before. We've seen two SEC teams getting into the playoff. So who's to say this can't happen again? Georgia and Alabama might be in the playoff again. If they play each other, that's determined on how the semifinals go. But Georgia's my number 14. And number 5, I have Ohio State. Ohio State lost a lot. They have good receivers, have a good running back, but they have a new quarterback. And Ohio State's defense is iffy to me. Yes, the Big 12, Big 10 is pretty easy to sleep through. But I don't know if they're. See, they have Penn State, they have Wisconsin, they have Indiana, maybe. They have these few teams that they might struggle with. The only team I can see really beating Ohio State is Penn State, and I don't know if Penn State's going to beat Ohio State. The Buckeyes are a good team. They've been in the playoffs a couple of times. They've been to the championship one time, and they lost last year to Alabama. But and you don't bring up the embarrassing blowout that they lost to. No one was beating Alabama last year, so you can't say, "Oh, Ohio State didn't belong in the playoffs last year." Yes, they did. That's why the playoffs are there, to determine who's the two best teams in the country and who gets there. Ohio State was the second best team, and they lost embarrassingly. But then again, nobody was going to come close to beating Alabama. So Ohio State's a good team. I don't know if I would say they're going to be in the playoffs this year. My best bet is probably not. They're probably going to miss it for the third time. Third time. I want to say third times. But I don't think Ohio State's going to make it to the playoffs this year. They're a good team. You can always count on Ohio State with Ryan Day to finish in the top five or top five at the least, maybe top 10 if they have a bad year. Ohio State's is too good to leave out of the top five in the preseason poll. They recruit amazingly. They came second to Alabama last year in the recruiting. But I mean, Ryan Day's a great recruiter. He's got a great team. I'm kind of I'm not fully sold on Ryan Day because he inherited a great team of Ohio State from Urban Meyer. Until I can see him with his own recruited players, his own team, and the way he's coaching, then I'll buy in it. He'll probably be a great coach. I mean, I'm not saying he's gonna once he has his players, he's gonna be awful. I'm not saying that. He's probably gonna be a great coach because he seems like a good coach and he can recruit well. And he seems like he's gonna be a good coach, finishing in the top five every year. Okay, number six, I have Texas A&M. Now, a lot of people are down or very not very high on Texas A&M. I'm kind of high on them because their only loss last year was to Alabama. It's not a bad loss. Everybody lost to Alabama. If you played them, you lost. But Texas A&M is pretty good. I'm high on Jimbo Fisher. I am sold on Jimbo Fisher. I am a buyer on him. He has a national championship. Not many coaches active now can say that. He won a national championship at Florida State with Jameis Winston back in 2014. Um, he is a good coach. He knows what he's doing, and he knows what he's doing at Texas A&M. He's recruiting well. He's doing well. He starts out slow sometimes, but he works his way, and once he gets a feel for what the team is doing, he's good at what he does. He can challenge Alabama this year. He can really give Alabama a run for the money this year. So I have him at six. I have Texas A&M at six. I don't know how they're going to be doing this year. They lost their quarterback. I mean, they almost dominated North Carolina in the Peach Bowl. Peach Bowl? Orange Bowl. One of those bowls. In their bowl game, they dominated technically North Carolina. So I have Texas A&M at six. Depending on how that goes, that might change. At seven, I have Iowa State. I am high on Iowa State actually. Last year was I don't think it's a fluke. They're a good, legitimately good team and a Big 12 title contender. Depending on if they can beat Oklahoma, they could probably win the Big 12. I got a good coach in Matt Campbell, and I just think they can challenge Oklahoma for the Big 12. Iowa State could be the bump in the road when it comes to Oklahoma's playoff hopes. If Iowa State can beat Oklahoma and not lose another game, they can get into the playoffs. I'm, I wouldn't put money on it. I wouldn't put money that Iowa State's going to make it into the playoffs. They're probably going to finish top 10 just because of their schedule and they don't have much competition. They can beat Texas. They can beat the rest of the Big 12. That loss to Louisiana was an embarrassment last year. But Iowa State's my seventh team in the country. Number eight, I have North Carolina. I have a problem with North Carolina. I have a problem with them being in the top 10 because North Carolina tends to win games that they're supposed to, but lose games they're not supposed to. Last year's loss to Florida State was embarrassing, and it was not acceptable. Florida State was not a good team. They won 3 games. That was just embarrassing. That was unacceptable. They were top. They were number 5 going into that game. They went to Tallahassee and they lost. And Florida State didn't score a single point in the second half, and they still lost. And North Carolina went in that game thinking that they could sleepwalk through the Florida State game and win, and they underestimated Florida State, and Florida State took advantage of that. You don't do that. North Carolina needs to take every game seriously. Virginia, they lost to Virginia. That's also an unacceptable loss. Virginia was not a good team last year. I'm high on Mac Brown. He's a good coach. He was a good coach at Texas. He's a good coach here. This is his second run at North Carolina as a head coach, but I just don't. North Carolina, I think they're going to finish top 10. They could be the bump in the road to Clemson for their playoffs hopes. What Iowa State is to Oklahoma, and North Carolina is to Clemson. Clemson could lose to North Carolina, depending on if North Carolina gets in the ACC championship game. North Carolina could beat Clemson and maybe North Carolina gets into the playoffs besides Clemson. But the problem with North Carolina is I cannot give them an undefeated season. I always think that they're going to lose a game that they're not supposed to. My examples are Virginia and Florida State last year. Mac Brown has never beaten Florida State. That's embarrassing. Well, at least now it is. Back then, Florida State was a powerhouse, but now they're not. You need to beat them. Florida State won't be a good team this year. They'll be improved, but they're not going to be a good team. So they should, if they beat Florida State this year, I don't think they're going to lose another game. I don't see any other competition they have other than Miami. Miami's a good team. Not, I mean, they got absolutely shredded by North Carolina last year. So I have North Carolina repeating that as well. And they're my number 8 team. Coming in at number 9, I have the Cincinnati Bearcats. I am in love with the Cincinnati team. They are my team that I absolutely love. Um, I'm high on Luke Fickell and Cincinnati. They are an amazing team. They nearly beat Georgia. They proved to the playoff committee that they were a legitimately good team. They lost to Georgia in their bowl game by a field goal. Cincinnati is a good team. They proved that they were not that their schedule didn't matter. They were a good team. They beat Georgia, and Georgia was a good team last year. They beat Georgia with JT Daniels. Cincinnati's defense is phenomenal. That is probably one of the top 10 defense, top 5 mostly, probably, defenses in college football. People rag on them because they're a group of 5 team. That doesn't matter. Group of 5 teams can be good. We saw how UCF in 2017 was. They went undefeated. Didn't have a good strength of schedule. But Cincinnati could very well get into the playoffs this year. They play Notre Dame and Indiana. Those are 2 Power 5 teams that are, well, people are high on Indiana this year. If Indiana continues to do good and Cincinnati beats them and they beat Notre Dame, which is probably going to be a 10-win team, 10, 11, 12-win team, depending on how they play this game, Cincinnati could very well get into the playoff if they don't if they don't lose another game. If they go 12-0, Cincinnati is going to be in the playoffs. Playoff committee could no longer bat an eye at, could no longer ignore Cincinnati and say you're not getting into the playoffs. The playoff committee would have to let them in because of them beating 2 Power 5 teams and going undefeated. But I'm very high on Cincinnati, and I'm glad the way they are ranked in the coaches poll. I'm glad they're getting the respect that they deserve because they really do. Number 10, which is probably a shocker to everybody, I have USC. I have USC, but I'm very high on them. I think they're going to be good this year. I think they could challenge for the Pac-12. They're probably going to win the Pac-12 North or South, whatever one they're going to win. They're probably going to win their division, and they're probably going to face Oregon in the Pac-12 title game. USC is going to be a better team than they were last year. Oregon, I don't know how they're going to do this year. Oregon is a confusing team to watch. Sometimes they're amazing. They're the cream of the crop in the Pac-12 sometimes. USC can be back to where they were. They want to get back to where they were back in 2005 when they were dominating and beating everybody that they came across. But they're not there yet. They need to rebuild a lot. And where they need to start is being better and beating Oregon and taking control of the Pac-12. I'm very high on them this year. I feel like they can win the Pac-12 this year. Are they making the playoffs? No, probably not. Unless something goes horribly wrong in the other Power 5 conferences, then USC's not making it in there. And they would have to go undefeated for that to happen and beat everybody by 50 points. I'm kidding, but I mean, I'm very high on USC, so that's my top 10. The first 3 out I have are, shockingly, Miami, Wisconsin, and Oregon. I'm very high on Miami. Miami's year was not a fluke. They are a legitimately good team. Like I said, they could probably beat North Carolina, and they could probably make it to the ACC title game against Clemson. Depending on whether they can beat Clemson or not is probably up to them how they play. Wisconsin. Wisconsin's a good team. They're always going to be a good team. Last year was a anomaly. I don't know what happened last year. Probably because the Big 12 canceled their season, and Wisconsin didn't plan on having any practice, and they didn't have practice. They had a jump start right into a season. Yes, they lost to Northwestern, but that's just Northwestern. Um, Wisconsin's a good team. You can probably uh, they're gonna win 9, 10 games a season. This is how they do. They can sweep walk through their schedule sometimes. The only loss they'll probably ever face is Ohio State in the Big Ten title game. I don't see them losing any other games. They're gonna lose a boneheaded game though eventually, like Penn State if they play. I don't know if they play them, but they're gonna lose a boneheaded game. But that's my first three out. Oregon. Oregon's, like I said, is a complicated team to predict. They always tend to come out of the Pac-12 and sleepwalk through it like it's nothing. But this year, Oregon, I think, is going to be down a little bit more, not because of the pandemic last year, but just because Oregon is not 2014, 2015 Oregon that they were, where they beat Florida State 59-24, I believe is the score. But they're not gonna be that type of Oregon, the number two team Oregon that you saw. They're going to be probably down this year. They could lose the Pac-12. USC could come out on top, but Oregon, I just don't see. I cannot put Oregon high enough, mainly because they're in the Pac-12, but I have USC at 10, just because I'm a little bit more higher on USC than I am Oregon. But Pac-12 teams are really difficult for me to put up in the top um 10, top 5 especially. I don't think I can ever put a Pac-12 team in the top 5, top 8, not happening. Okay, back to the coaches poll. I switched teams around. I put Oklahoma at 2, Clemson at 3, Georgia at 4, Ohio State at 5. Notre Dame is not even in my top 10. I would put them probably to the 14 to 19 range. Not Notre Dame. I can't be high on Notre Dame. They have some of the weakest schedules, and once they get into the playoffs, they get blown out. They're basically Oklahoma, but independent. I've been saying time and time again, Notre Dame needs to join a conference or stop playing college football. Um, but Cincinnati's at 9, I believe. I put them a little bit higher. Florida probably. I would not put Florida at 11. Florida is losing a lot of talent and a lot of production. They lost Kyle Trask, Kyle Pitts. They lost two of their best offensive players right there. And they have Emory Jones coming in. Emory Jones, I'm not high on. I don't like him. He's not a good player. The only thing he's good for is running quarterback sneaks and quarterback runs. But I don't think Florida's going to be good this year. They could actually fall out of the top 25 and not be ranked at the end of the season, depending on how their season goes. Probably going to lose to Alabama. Probably going to lose to LSU. Probably going to lose to Georgia. If they lose to Florida State, you better bet that they're going to be out of the top 25. Um, LSU, their LSU season last year was an anomaly. They just won a national championship, but I don't think they're going to be as bad as they were. Probably a 7-5 team. Indiana, I am high on as well. Indiana's probably not going to come out of the Big Ten winning it. Probably going to challenge Ohio State like they did last year. Not any better. Ohio State's still probably going to beat them. Iowa, I am very high on Iowa as well. They are a good Big Ten team. They rarely challenge for the Big Ten, but they're a good Big Ten team, kind of like Wisconsin. You can pencil them in for like 7, 8, 9 wins a year. So they're a good team. Texas has a rebuilding to do. They have Steve Sarkisian in as head coach from Alabama. He's a good offensive mind. Depending on how well he can do it, Texas is up to this season. But I do think they're going to be good. Whether they beat Oklahoma this year is a mystery, but we'll see. Penn State. I'll talk about Penn State. I don't like Penn State for multiple reasons. They're a good team. I don't hate any of their staff. I don't hate any of their players. I just hate their school. So Penn State's a good team. They can probably beat Ohio State. So we'll see how that goes. Penn State's a good team. They can challenge for the Big Ten. Penn State or Ohio State's going to come out of the Big Ten as a champion. My early pick, Ohio State. Depending on how the season progresses, it could be Penn State eventually. Washington. I'm high on Washington. Washington's a good Pac-12 team. If you told me to list the top three teams in the Pac-12, I would give you Oregon, USC, and Washington. Washington is another Pac-12 team that has been to the playoffs. They got dominated by Alabama, but hey, they made it to the playoffs. That's an accomplishment on its own. So Washington, I'm very high on. I like their spot. I like where all these teams are. I would put Coastal Carolina above Louisiana, just because Coastal Carolina was pretty good. I think Coastal Carolina beat Louisiana last year as well. But they Coastal Carolina gets a lot of teams back, a lot of players back. Believe they get their quarterback back, Isaiah Likely. Isaiah Likely's a good player. I think they get their quarterback back as well. I cannot remember his name. I know Isaiah Likely is coming back. Ole Miss is a good team. Ole Miss I wouldn't put in the top 25. I don't know who I'd replace them with. Probably Northwestern I'd replace Ole Miss with. Ole Miss could probably eventually finish on the top 25, but Ole Miss could challenge Alabama depending on how amazing their offense is. Uh, so I think Ole Miss will do well this season just because of their offensive Lane Kiffin, Lane Train. It's probably gonna, steamroll some people depending on how well they do. But uh, Oklahoma State, they're pretty good in their spot. Miami kind of a little bit higher. I'd put Florida lower, USC higher, LSU lower. Yeah, that's my top 25, and that's my opinion on how I think it should go. Preseason polls don't really matter. It's the only thing matters is the 12 game college football regular season and the AP poll, and eventually the college football playoff rankings. But that preseason polls are just to tell you what people think and just give you some sort of college football material so you don't go through college football withdrawal before the season starts. But yeah, that's my opinion. No one asked for it, but here it is. I hope you enjoy this video, and I'll see y'all in the next video.